But I really wanted to get to this program that we're having tonight. Maria Tatar, who is the author of The Heroine with 1,001 Faces. And the reason we're having this program is I was reading the New York Times book review section. And rarely do you see such a full page review of a book in the New York Times. And this was September 24th, 2021. And it was called The Heroine's Journey Gets Equal Time, which I thought was really an appropriate title. And it talks about, it begins with this article, Joseph Campbell, who was a famous writer, who wrote the book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces. And so Maria, during the pandemic, had many hours of free time. And she was thinking about the Me Too movement, which had started. And so she wrote what she calls an extension, not a rebuttal, but more of an extension to this, to his book. And it is called a sequel, an extension sequel, and it's called A Heroine with 1,001 Faces. And so she talks about her childhood and learning about heroines and how she learned about them through folklore. She has written two, at least that I know of, two books on fairy tales, if you will. And the images of those books are at the bottom, beautiful images of the books. And it's just an amazing, it's an amazing idea to have this book. She talks about people who, from Scheherazade to Nancy Drew to Wonder Woman, and how the fairness, integrity, and what was the other word that you used? Fairness, integrity. I have to go find it because okay, can't find it. What she thought about, curiosity, empathy, and fairness of these heroines that she talked about. So I hope you will enjoy her speech. Just a little bit about Maria herself. She is a world-renowned folklorist, and she is a professor at Harvard University. In fact, she is the first woman at Harvard University to rise from the ranks of a assistant professor to a full tenured position. So all of you, please welcome Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. And I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. So here we are, the Heroine with 1,001 Faces. And you can see I have a different trio here, curiosity, craft, and care. And I'm going to talk later about the way in which curiosity and care are etymologically related. I'm also going to use craft in two senses of the term. First of all, craft, cunning, using your wits, designing, and craft as an activity that is entangled in the arts, that is in the productive work that's been done by women through the ages as they fashion the social fabric, mending, sewing, knitting, spinning, and making whole. And all three of these features are, as I'll try to show, deeply enmeshed with justice and beauty. So let us begin with, I'm going to go back just a second. Here is our roadmap for today. And I'm going to start by talking about the genesis of the book. And as Joan mentioned, Joseph Campbell figures importantly in the origins of the book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and also Scheherazade, the woman in the 1,001 Nights, the storyteller. And I want to talk also about how the pandemic reshaped our collective concept of heroism. Then turn to the question, what is a heroine? Looking at curious women, and here we'll glance at Pandora and Eve, and then turn to women from antiquity, women who are deprived of a voice, who are deprived of speech in one way or another, but then use the domestic crafts, use textiles to speak out. And here, Philomela and Arachne figure importantly. And we'll also take a quick look at Sister Mary from British folklore. And then turn to Bluebeard's wife. And we'll see that curiosity gets to be inflected as something perilous, dangerous. Bluebeard is a cautionary tale. And from there, I want to move right into the 20th and 21st centuries with a kind of bifurcation of heroines. I can't talk about all of them that are in the book, but I wanted to focus on women detectives who are seeking justice, looking at Nancy Drew and also at Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, and then at women writers and their craft, starting with Jo March and in Little Women, up to Hannah Horvath in Girls. And then finally, I want to conclude with a meditation on craft, curiosity, and care versus empathy. Empathy, this affect that we've sort of enshrined as one of our highest cultural values. So before I begin with the genesis of the book, just a quick word. I can't resist. I can't stop myself. A quick word about libraries. And if you have not read Neil Gaiman's wonderful article about libraries, it was published in The Guardian some years ago. And read it, it's online. And he tells us that libraries are about freedom, freedom to read, freedom of ideas, freedom of communication, education, entertainment, safe spaces, and access to information. And I cite him because I sort of grew up, I appreciate his observations all the more because I did grow up in a library. Reading as if for life, like David Copperfield, as he put it, losing myself and then also finding myself in the safe space of that library. So hats off to the librarians at all of these, not just these two, but all libraries. Now, a few words on the genesis of the book. John mentioned that it was written during a time when we were all holding out for a hero. And I want to take you back to those first few months of the pandemic, when the possibilities for heroism were really foreclosed. What could we do? We were told to stay home, basically, and everything became silent. It's true there was less traffic, there were no traffic jams, we suddenly heard birds, we saw forms of wildlife that we'd never seen before, but it quickly turned spooky. That is, our towns were deserted and we somehow learned the meaning of lockdown as silence filled the air. And it was around that time that I read Carlos Fuentes and came across his observation about how writing is a struggle against silence. And that was when I took to writing. The book was a response to a crisis. Writing became therapeutic for me. It kept me alive and it animated me. So many astonishing things, of course, happened during the pandemic. But for one thing, we rebooted the concept of heroism. We defined it in new ways. All those heroes from times past, soldiers, generals, warriors, spiritual leaders, sort of lost status. In 2020, we removed 100 statues of Confederate soldiers from public places. Replacing them with what? Monuments to emancipation and to freedom, honoring the enslaved and the heroic survivors of slavery. And the Confederate general in Statuary Hall in the Capitol was replaced by civil rights activist and educator Mary McLeod Bethune. And the question is who are, in addition to these figures, you can see here some of our new heroes, statues being taken down and then replaced by new ones. And our new heroes include also healthcare workers. And notice the term care embedded in that term, healthcare workers and scientists. That is those who exercise care, compassion, who are invested in healing, and those who are driven by curiosity. by a desire for knowledge. And presto, that sort of became my, my new base for thinking about heroines. So, well, what is a hero? If we can turn now to Campbell and Scheherazade, these two unlikely pairing. I remember sitting in a soulless hall taking my SAT exam and finding that the essay question, I think it was a full hour, was what is a hero? And here I was, a voracious reader, as you know, from my library experience, and I was totally stumped. I thought of Achilles and all of these people that really did not seem to be great models of heroism. And today, many of us will still reach for Joseph Campbell for his book to figure out, what a hero is. And of course, his book gives us a hero who is male-coded and male-centric. And yes, the names are almost exclusively male. You do see Lady Liberty there, but of course, she embodies an abstract concept. So in the Grammar of Mythology, Campbell told his readers, men are the heroes. And what are women? They represent the totality of what can be known. And the hero, Campbell added sort of cryptically, is the one who comes to know. In other words, women never really have to leave the house. They're either mothers, they give birth to the hero, or they're the goal of the hero. And there you have, in the next slide, the hero's journey, which was popularized basically in Christopher Vogler's book, The Writer's Journey. Campbell's book became the playbook for Hollywood for many decades, in part through the series that some of you may know, The Power of Myth with Bill Moyers. And as I mentioned, Vogler sort of condensed Campbell's book, which is really tough going at times. I think I spent an entire week reading the volume. He condensed it and created an instructional manual for screenwriters. And here are a couple of efforts to try to chart the journey of the hero, which can basically be boiled down to these 12 steps. And I think you can further reduce it to departure, crossing a threshold, an ordeal, and then a return with an elixir, a magic potion, anything that brings healing. And as I noted earlier, healing, making whole will also be the mission of the heroine. And I like to think of the heroine less as embarking on an adventure than on embarking on a mission. So the critique of Campbell comes on the one side from someone like Madeline Miller, who had much the same reaction to the question, what is a hero, that I had. And she tells us, I love that Odysseus and Achilles are complete disasters as heroes. They make terrible mistakes. They're proud and angry. They're not ideal. They're not moral exemplars. They're deeply flawed. And then we have another form of critique coming from James Baldwin, who tells us that in the US, violence and heroism have been made synonymous, except when it comes to Blacks. Basically, if you're a Black hero, you're likely to be put in jail. But of course, Campbell also gives us only half the story. And he left out what George Eliot in the famous last sentence of Middlemarch called unhistoric. Well, actually, let's go to hidden lives, which he called hidden lives. Here's that last sentence. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who live faithfully a hidden life, and they rest in unvisited tombs. So they wear these cloaks of invisibility. So heroines, I found, are not defined by the search for glory or immortality, like the heroes of ancient times. And instead, they fight for their own survival, and they try to save others, to heal, to make whole. And they may not have traditional weapons, but they have words. Words and stories become their tools for finding justice. So here we have Scheherazade, who crafts stories with craft. And I'm turning now to the 1001 in my book title. And by the way, I'm not really trying to do Campbell one better with 1001, but I love the Arabic. I love the fact that the Arabic 1001 captures the idea of a vast number and a swerve into something without limits. It's really sort of the equivalent of our infinity. And what it gets at is, I think, the endless possibilities for heroism. And here we have a quote about Shahryar, about the premise of the 1001 Nights. And if you read the frame story, which you probably did not read as a child, but if you read the frame story as an adult, you know that Shahryar catches his wife in flagrante. And after that, he is convinced that all women are false and faithless. And he vows to put to death each of his wives after the first nuptial night. But Scheherazade saves her life. She survives by entertaining Shahryar with fascinating tales that she tells for 1001 nights. And Shahryar postpones the execution of his wife. So Scheherazade basically understands the seductive power of story. She saves her own life, as I pointed out, but she also spares the lives of other women, and she changes the culture in which she lives. So Shahryar becomes a more just ruler, and he repudiates his bloody vows. So Scheherazade became this kind of foundational figure because she uses storytelling to survive and to secure justice. And also in the frame narrative, we learn that she is a scholar and a reader. She's caring, and she uses craft to make a better world. Scheherazade, though, has really taken a back seat in many ways to two figures, Pandora, first of all, Pandora and Eve. Pandora famously released all evil into the world, disease, war, vice, toil, and she shoulders the responsibility for evil. Today, I came across a comic book artist named Ray Fox, who has a Pandora series, and he writes, every evil in the DC universe is connected to Pandora, and that's what her story is largely about. So we have Pandora, who succumbs to temptation, and then Eve, who also succumbs to curiosity. She's the real villain of Genesis. She's responsible for the fall. She tempts Adam, and Eve's curiosity is really inflected as carnal rather than intellectual. So our two foundational figures, Pandora and Eve, are plagued by curiosity, which becomes a negative trait. And also that curiosity is sexualized. So Eve's body, like Pandora's, if we look at her there, is marked by carnal knowledge, heavily eroticized. But in fact, both Eve and Pandora are motivated by a desire for knowledge, pure and simple. And here is something that I extracted from the Oxford English Dictionary on curiosity. Very early on in writing the book, I decided to try to trace the etymology of the term curiosity. And looking at the Oxford English Dictionary, I was astonished that curiosity, and you see the first meaning is obsolete. Curiosity was once carefulness, the application of care or attention. And the second definition is also exactness. And the third is proficiency, skill, cleverness, ingenuity. And then care or attention carried to excess. So you can see there's a positive and negative valence to curiosity. There's the desire to know or learn in a blamable sense, as the OED puts it, and then in a neutral or good sense. What's important here, though, is that care and craft are both embedded in curiosity, and that the word can designate skill, cleverness, ingenuity, and craft. So now if we can turn from those abstractions to some stories, some electrifying stories. And I think that the fact that the domestic arts, spinning and weaving, are intimately connected with storytelling becomes evident in this tale of two sisters. And this is a story that Ovid told in the Metamorphoses, these stories about transformations. And on the top left, you see Philomela, and she is being assaulted by her brother-in-law, Tereus. And after the rape, what does she do? She threatens to rat him out. She threatens to broadcast his misdeeds. And what does he do in response? He cuts out her tongue. And Ovid gives us this graphic, prolonged description of the tongue quivering on the ground. And Philomela is deprived of speech. And you see the second illustration there too of Philomela's assault. What does she do but use her domestic skills? And she weaves a tapestry displaying Tereus's crime. Her voice, in other words, is restored through art. And here you have Philomela's words to Tereus. She says, "I'll cast aside my modesty. I'm going to speak. My voice will fill the trees." And then the stump throbbing in her mouth, the stump of the tongue, and the tongue falling on the black earth and twitching as it flings itself about, just as a serpent's severed tail will do. So Philomela weaves the story of her rape into this tapestry, and she takes it to her sister, to Procne, and the two exact a terrible revenge on Tereus. So we can see here a sharp contrast to Campbell's heroes, because again, heroines are on a mission, not a journey, and they use storytelling to secure justice and to right wrongs. They basically deploy women's domestic craft, fabrics, and textiles because they're so often deprived of verbal expression, of speech in the public sphere. So Philomela shatters the limits placed on female craft, and her tapestry basically occupies the space of art and creating meaning. And here is Arachne. I promised you Philomela, Arachne, and Lady Mary. Here is Arachne, who also transforms the craft of weaving into the art of creating meaning. If you remember, Arachne has the audacity to challenge Athena, to challenge a goddess to a weaving competition. And what does she put into her tapestry? She brazenly depicts the heavenly crimes of the gods in her work. She displays their abuse of power. She includes the stories of Europa, of Leda, of Medusa, of Antiope. These are all victims of sexual assault. When Athena sees Arachne's weaving, she's so angry because she sees that she's losing the competition, that she hits the girl over the head with a spindle, tears her work into pieces, and Arachne hangs herself out of a sense of shame. And then oddly, it's not clear why, but maybe out of a sense of pity, it's said by some interpreter, by some interpreters of the story, out of a sense of pity for Arachne, Athena turns her into a spider. If we turn to Edith Hamilton, and that's kind of the text for high school. It was for many years. It may not be read in high schools anymore, but it was the high school introduction to Greek myth. And Edith Hamilton tells us in that volume, this is a story about the danger of claiming equality with the gods. So Arachne is seen as proud. She's a woman, a mere mortal, who sees her weaving as superior to Athena's, and how dare she do that? So quite appropriately, she's silenced. Her work, which broadcast all of those misdeeds, is destroyed, and she's basically shut down by the goddess. And I would argue by patriarchy in a way, although, clearly she's a female goddess, but complicated story there. So we can see that weaving is really one of the conspiratorial crafts. It's a domestic art, and it's executed with ingenuity. Remember that aspect, that feature that is part of curiosity. So the production of textiles and texts is beautifully entangled here, as we see, and both textiles and text derive from the Latin texere, and to construct or weave, and also from the Greek techne, art, craft, or skill. In other words, the weaving of textiles and the production of texts belong basically to the same economy, and they're driven by the same logic. So in the world of Greek myth, women's speech is perpetually invalidated. Telemachus tells Penelope to shut up and do her weaving. Cassandra speaks the truth again and again, but she has no credibility, and so on and so forth. But there were social spaces where women could talk, where they could chatter, gossip, exchange information, where they could spin yarns and tell stories. And that was, of course, the domestic arena, the space where household tasks were carried out. I think it's not by chance that the Brothers Grimm called their folk tales, published in the early 19th century, children's stories and household tales. These were stories that were told basically by women, by nurses, by nannies to children, and then also told in the household to lighten labors, to make time pass while discharging repetitive labors. So I want to highlight a couple of examples from that collection to reveal how women told their stories, how, this is almost like an early Me Too movement in many ways. So fairy tales basically circulated valuable information about romance, courtship, and marriage. They provided golden nuggets of wisdom, and they give us a collection of heroines, unsung heroines, basically. Before I turn to the Grimms, here's poor Arachne turned into a spider in Gustave Doré's 19th century illustration. Here's the story. We'll go to British folklore for a moment. Do you remember Lady Mary? She figures in the British story, Mr. Fox, a tale collected in the 1890s by Joseph Jacobs. And built into this story is a tutorial about how tales can be instruments for securing social justice. So Mr. Fox, who is rich and handsome, courts a young woman named Lady Mary. And Lady Mary, who is a brave one, decides to visit his castle. She's a curious woman. She gets to the castle and she explores its dark reaches. Over one door is written, be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood should run cold. Well, Lady Mary is bold, she's curious, and her heart's blood does run cold when she discovers a bloody chamber in the castle. And what do you think she saw? And I quote here, why, bodies and skeletons of beautiful young ladies all stained with blood. And then suddenly Mr. Fox appears, and he's dragging a young woman behind him. You see Lady Mary here hiding behind a wine cask, and she witnesses how he chops off a hand, her hand, which has a finger on it. And it turns out the hand lands in Lady Mary's lap, and it provides her with the evidence she needs to indict Mr. Fox, a man who has turned from a partner, from marriage material into an adversary. And how does she convict him? at the wedding banquet, which you see here, she tells a dream. She narrates a dream about finding a bloody chamber. Mr. Fox insists that she's lying, but what does Lady Mary do? She produces the hand and the ring. At once, her brothers and her friends drew their swords and cut Mr. Fox into 1,000 pieces. So there's kind of a meta quality to this fairy tale. It's self-referential because in a way what it does is it gives us a story about the value of storytelling. Mr. Fox reads almost like a playbook from times past for victims of sexual assault and of arranged marriages. And here we come to the Brothers Grimm and their story, The Robber Bridegroom, which tells a similar tale. And here, the heroine broadcasts the misdeeds of her betrothed, again at a wedding banquet. And once again, the relatives, the assembled relatives, do him in. So these are the stories that we call old wives' tales, and they flourished around the fireside, in spinning rooms, as I said, in sewing circles, or in the kitchen. And John Updike referred to them as the television and pornography of an earlier age. But I think that they were more than that. They were also cautionary tales about love, courtship, and marriage. And something funny happened to these gossipy tales when they moved from the domestic arena, from storytelling circles into print culture. Take the case of the story of Bluebeard. This is a story about a man who murders his wives, and he murders them because he's punishing them for their disobedience and curiosity. So before leaving for a trip, there's Bluebeard. He hands his wife a key. I mean, it's a wonderfully seductive scene. He hands her a key. He tells her she can go anywhere, do anything, but don't go in the room that can be opened with this key. Well, of course, the wife goes in, and what does she find? But you can see it on the right, the corpses of Bluebeard's previous wives. Now, this story was written down by Charles Perrault in France. We're in 1697, so it's a really early print fairy tale. It was a tale that was probably, as I said, told in oral storytelling cultures. But Perrault got his hands on Bluebeard, and he turned this hair-raising story about a killer husband into a cautionary tale about female curiosity. And why do I say that? Because if we look at the moral to the story that Perrault added, you see that he tells us, one, the moral, he actually included two morals. One says, you know, husbands aren't really that bad. They're not that violent. And the second moral is curiosity, in spite of its many charms, can bring with it serious regrets. You can see 1,000 examples of it every day. Women succumb, but it's a fleeting pleasure. As soon as you satisfy it, it ceases to be, and it always proves very costly. So, I mean, you see again how curiosity is sexualized in a strange way. And when Bruno Bettelheim, in his uses of enchantment, wrote about this particular story, he saw Bluebeard's wife as a woman who had betrayed her husband. That she's sort of like Shahryar's wife. She is guilty of a sexual transgression of carnal knowledge, again, rather than intellectual curiosity. So a story once told as a cautionary fable by women to other women, you know, cautionary in the sense of get to know your husband, because who knows what dark secrets he might have. And just because he's rich doesn't mean necessarily that he's going to be a great husband. And there are all kinds of other lessons you can draw from that story. But this tale, as I said, once a cautionary tale, was aligned with tales about Eve, Pandora, and other curious women. So like Eve and Pandora, Bluebeard's wife suffers from epistemophilia. I love that term. Epistemophilia, a love of knowledge and the impulse to inquire. But Bluebeard's wife is rarely seen as heroic. Instead, she's scolded for her curiosity. And in one print version of the story after another in the 19th century, up through about the mid-20th century, and even a little later, she's seen as guilty of curiosity. She's the guilty one, not the serial murderer husband. So it's not until the 20th century, I think, that women managed to find productive outlets for their innate curiosity. And I want to talk about two possibilities. And here I'm turning to women writers and how they staged two career opportunities for curious ladies. So the desire for knowledge and the exercise of investigative skills moves along two paths. One, detective work, and detective work takes us straight to Nancy Drew and to Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, two figures who are both seeking justice. And then storytelling, with writers now engaged, female writers engaged in social critique, either that or taking on the role of journalists seeking truth and social justice. So I'll just say a few words about female detectives, a few words about writers, women writers, and then a quick conclusion on empathy. And then I hope we'll have time for some discussion. But female detectives, private eyes, you can go from Nancy in her roadster to Miss Marple in her rocking chair. And basically you have two ends of the age spectrum. These female detectives are driven by curiosity, determined to find justice. And curiously, they both made their appearances, their first appearances in 1930. I should mention that Nancy Drew was banned from most libraries. It wasn't available in my hometown library, much to my regret. I had to borrow copies from friends. And yet, as we now know, she was a source of inspiration for Hillary Clinton, for Sonia Sotomayor, for Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They all write with appreciation about reading the Nancy Drew series when they were young. River Heights, where Nancy lives, is plagued by robberies, and Nancy is the one who restores stolen goods to their rightful owners. She also embodies an ethics of care, as we'll see here. Oh, I seem to have lost a slide. But her friend George says, you're always getting yourself out. You're always putting yourself, oh, here we are. You're always putting yourself out to do a kindness for somebody. I think my mouse did not appreciate being dropped. Hang on. You're always putting yourself out to do a kindness for somebody or other who simply doesn't count in your life at all. And then we have Miss Marple, Christie's Marple, a spinster sleuth who becomes a lead actor. She puts detectives to shame. She solves cases without a team of subordinates. And she's actually a gossipy old lady who knits and gardens. She minds her own business, all the while getting into everybody else's business. She was inquisitive. And one of the mysteries in which she features is called Nemesis. She wears a hat with a bird's wing, an unmistakable allusion, I think, to the winged Greek goddess. Miss Marple embodies Nemesis, according to other characters. And if we look at Justice, Nemesis, and the Furies, I think it's interesting that they're so often embodied as women. There you see the Furies, Justice, Nemesis, Albrecht Dürer's Nemesis. One character in one of the Miss Marple series says he was thinking to himself that Miss Marple was very unlike the popular idea of the avenging Fury. And yet he thought that was exactly what she was. So knitting joins spinning, weaving, and creating tapestries as an activity that goes hand in hand with dispensing justice. And what does Miss Marple do but restore reputations, secure inheritances, and stabilize a social order in which, ironically, she herself is marginalized? So what is the takeaway here? I'm writing not just about a secret history of heroines, as it were, but also trying to highlight the value of craft curiosity and care in securing justice. So as I mentioned in my book, I also track women writers, in particular girls, from Jo March in Little Women to Anne of Green Gables over here, and Francie in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, to Harriet the Spy and Star Carter in The Hate You Give. And I also turn to girls, that is GIRRRLS, girls like Carrie Bradshaw, Hannah Horvath, and Rory Gilmore, for whom writing becomes a holy grail, and who use their writing to bring about social change. Hannah Horvath, for example, goes from narcissistic navel-gazing to writing that incorporates social critique. So you can see that craft, curiosity, and care have been the strategic tools for women. And yet today, as I mentioned, we enshrine empathy as our highest cultural virtue, with hundreds of books about the topic, many of which are geared toward children. Kindness Makes Me Stronger, a book of empathy, a workbook for kids on empathy. And psychologists tell us that, and they've conducted many studies along these lines, that reading promotes empathy in powerful ways. That is, we become better people when we read fiction. And George Eliot made that case many years ago when she wrote, "If art does not enlarge men's sympathies, it does nothing morally." And yet Rousseau worried about reading sentimental fictions. And he tells us, in giving our tears to these fictions, we have satisfied all the rights of humanity without having to give anything more of ourselves. Unfortunate people in real life would require attention, relief, consolation, and work. And I think you can all tell where he's coming from. That is, empathy is not enough. You have to do the hard work of paying attention, of caring, and of healing. There have been a number of scholarly critiques of empathy. There's Paul Bloom's Against Empathy. And Paul Bloom tells us that empathy is basically self-serving. And he embraces the idea of rational compassion. Fritz Breithaupt has written a book called The Dark Side of Empathy. And I love his term, vampiristic empathy. He worries about that. And Namwali Serpil has written a wonderful piece in the New York Review of Books called The Banality of Empathy. And she juxtaposes empathy with critical thinking. And I think Serpil's critique is important because our mythical and fictional heroines point to the importance of using craft, using your brain, using your wits, of curiosity, investigating, inquiring, and exploring, and care, that is, showing compassion, all as they set about the task of securing justice and making the world a more fair place. And I would say fair in both senses of the term, beautiful and just. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's, oh, you're still on the screen share. Do you think you could get off it for a moment?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Let's see.
So while she's doing that, we're opening it up to questions. If anybody would just type it in the chat function, I could read it and Maria would be, I'm sure, happy to answer your questions. But while you're doing this, I was, Nancy Drew was one of my favorite books growing up. And then you listed in quite a group of impressive women who also enjoyed it. So I felt I was in really good company there. Thank you. Did you learn anything that surprised you in any of these fairy tales when you were writing them? Was there
In the
anything
fairy
that
tales or fiction? Oh, I was constantly surprised.
constant?
I think mainly because every time I picked up a book, I found that the whole idea of female heroism as something very different from the male model was confirmed. And, teasing out the features was a challenge. I reconfigured all the, and I remember when I first started writing, when I first put pen to paper or picked up my laptop, I thought about, I was actually going to call it the heroine's ordeal. And Campbell uses that, the ordeal of the hero, that men go on a journey, the hero goes on a journey, women experience an ordeal. And it's not that. I mean, it's true, there's plenty of suffering in these myths and fairy tales and in our fictions and in our films and everywhere in our culture.
Certainly.
But there's
Right.
also extraordinary bravery and compassion and a willingness, not just to survive, but to make sure that others will be all right and that the culture will change so that, those who are not yet alive, those who are not yet born will come into a better world. So I think, it's not as if this became repetitive, but I expected a little bit more. I mean, to be sure, there's heterogeneity in the way these heroines are constructed, but these features seem to be so constant that I found myself almost embracing the idea of an archetype, which is something that, a concept that has been attacked by many academics as being timeless and universal and leading to stereotypical thinking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, the questions are coming in, so I was just, there's a lot of questions. Okay, the first question is, what happened to Bluebeard's wife?
Oh, well, there is a happy ending. Of course, each version of the story is slightly different. And in the one that Perrault wrote down, she summons Sister Anne, who in turn summons the brothers, who at the last minute, there's a rescue at the last minute, they kill Bluebeard, and she remarries and lives happily with her new husband, marries her sister off and all of that. So she is definitely a survivor. And I think, again, if you go back and imagine, and, we can't recreate this or reconstruct this, but, I can see this as a very powerful story about how, you watch out, but you also can survive this because you've got friends, you've got relatives who will come to you. You don't need to be silent and keep things to yourself. Very powerful message.
True. And this one is an interesting question. And I just want to give you, I hope it's okay, Scott, that I'm just going to say who you are. Scott Mason is one of the foremost haiku poets in the world. And he is a Chappaqua resident. And this is his question. There are many real women in the book. Are there any real women in the book? It strikes me that the Baroque artist Artemisia Gentileschi had much in common with Philomena.
You're absolutely right. And, the whole question of why did I not include more women from real life? Because I was looking at mythical, fictional constructs, how heroism had been figured in times past. By the way, I did, though, in my conclusion, include some real life figures, nurses, healthcare workers, brave women who set up the profession of nursing or who went to war and were, in medical units, who disguised themselves as men. So there are wonderful stories there. But I think, there's another book to be written about and there are, of course, already many other books out there about real life heroines. And then the history of art. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a story to be told. How are women represented? How have they been represented? How have they been I mean, look at those images of Eve and Pandora, and the way they're positioned as these seductive evil figures. They're also beautiful. Pandora is the beautiful evil. So she takes us in these two directions. So thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, there are many more books to be written, and there are already many books out there which take up some of the questions that you just raised.
Okay, another question, please comment on continuing difference of meaning of the two words, hero and heroine.
Different. Well, let's see. Yeah, I suppose, there's a real problem that you raise with that question, which is this a rigid binary? And, we're living in an era of gender fluidity, of non-binary people. And so these are really historical concepts. And I think actually we're moving more toward a non-gendered model in which guess what? Everyone can be a heroine. Yes, there will also be heroes. There have to be brave fighters and warriors. But these two models, since we have hero, heroine, they are gendered. But maybe somebody can come up with another way to conceptualize things. Your question also raises the issue of, as I was writing this book, I thought about the heroism of everyday life, the way in which, when you get through a day, it is a triumph. People who are, dealing with adversity, who are, even if you're just raising children under the best of circumstances. I remember I always felt that at the end of the day, when my kids were in bed, I should be given a medal. But there was nobody there to give me a medal. And so, there might be ways to think about heroism. And I hate to think of it as lowercase, because it's not, there's still a lot of bravery in everyday life, but heroism with a capital H, which, are cultural heroes, the people that we look up. And, these days, there are powerful critiques of this idea of fetishizing the hero, and singling one person out as the leader. I mean, it's a very undemocratic principle as well. So yes, lots of problems to solve in terms of how we think about heroes and heroines in our culture.
True. Again, true. Do you think that Mary Magdalene was a sort of anti-Pandora?
Interesting. I wish I could speak with my interlocutor here, because I'm thinking about washing the feet of Christ and the humility, the fact that she's a prostitute or was, and I'm not sure. As certainly very different features in the sense of humility would move her in a completely different direction. But I'm a little stumped by that question. I wish I could talk to you.
That was Scott again. And the final question is how much you see Lisbeth Salander. She was from The Girl with the Spider Tattoo. I don't know if you read that.
Oh, yes.
Fitting into your thesis.
Yes, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. She fits in perfectly. And I think I remember reading The Girl with the first volume in the trilogy on a plane to New Zealand. And I plopped down into my seat and opened the book, and I looked to my side, and there's a 20-something guy who's reading the same book and is at the same point in the volume. So it was a great experience because we got to compare notes. But Lisbeth Salander is one of our new heroines. And I mean, look at her. She's, non-binary for sure, both in the book and in
Right.
in the film. And she moves in the category of what folklorists call the trickster figure, a figure that is driven by hunger, by the need to survive. I mean, think about the way she's abused both as a child and then as an adult by this attorney, this predatory attorney. So she's very much a victim, but she's determined to survive, live by her wits as the trickster does, and take the contradictions in her culture, take them up and change her culture and she does it, in a variety of ways. First of all, by hacking into computers. So she's kind of mercurial, and she has access to the circuitry of a culture. So she's quick-witted, and she's also strong and muscular. So she, I think, is a foundational figure for women, like girls and women like Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, or Snow White in the film Snow White and the Huntsman, who is armed and ready for combat. So we have a whole range of figures, women in popular culture, who are mimicking the male model and taking over the roles that were traditionally assigned to men, which were the warrior hero and also the trickster figure, which, if you read Lewis Hyde's wonderful book on the trickster figure, you'll know that traditionally tricksters like Anansi, Hare, and Coyote were all gendered male. So yes, thank you for that question.
Anansi, was that the spider?
Anansi, the spider god
Spider.
in African cultures.
Yeah, in Africa.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who then migrates to the US as Nancy becomes feminized, actually.
And then the very last question, and then we'll let everyone go. Madeline and Pandora both carried jars. I guess this is just a comment. Both carried jars, one with anointment for Christ and the other the world's ills.
Thank you for that addition. Yes, so they're kind of bookends, and they can be analyzed in different ways. I'll have to take a closer look at her and see how she fits into this typology.
Well, it was already, we're getting compliments. It was a wonderful presentation from the audience. And for me, I thank you so much. And the questions were wonderful, very different than I thought they would be. So thank you so much, Maria. I hope everybody will purchase the book, A Heroine or Heroine. I noticed that we said it differently, with 1001 Faces. And I hope you will all enjoy it. And again, thank you all for coming. And Maria, especially, thank you so much for all your time and effort in getting this together.
Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. Bye, everyone, and have a good evening.